Nighttime on Still Waters. This is NB 506812, narrowcasting into the night from somewhere on Britain's waterways. July 3rd, Thursday. Walking up the hill, the grass crackles and scrunches with each step. If I closed my eyes, I would have said I was walking through deep snow, if it were not for the hum of bees and the wind that wraps me in warmth. All day the clouds have hung angry and heavy, growling and oppressive. A few specks of rain have danced on the wind, but nothing more. And everything feels frontal and unsettled. The wind skims the water's surface, painting ripples that catch the dull grey of the snarling sky. And this is the narrowboat Erica, narrowcasting into the darkness of a sultry midsummer night, to you, wherever you are. I was hoping you'd come. It's so good to see you. Now quickly come inside and make yourself comfortable before the brewing storm eventually breaks, if it ever does. But it looks like you've made it just in time. Large spots of rain are beginning to patter and drum. And the kettle is on, and the biscuit barrel has been restocked and is on the side. So come on in and welcome aboard. Bed straws, meadow sweet, misty veils of lace and tiny stars that soften and glow along the water's edge. Now is the time for the hedgerows and banksides to foam with floral froth. It's as if the great rolling wave of midsummer is about to break. In this way, nature surfs the seasons. Summer grasses, brittle and browning into the honey-coloured tawny browns, snap and rattle in the broiling winds, and the earth beneath them cracks, as if open-mouthed and pleading for rain. Peaks of heat come and go, but the temperatures remain a little higher than average, and today it felt stormy. Heavy skies seemed to press down on the gently folding fields, although in fact they were still actually quite high. And it felt like rain. The wind truculent and stormy. It was, for the first time in a while, that it felt a little like a typical British summer's day. Warm but overcast and the trace of rain in the wind. But none came. And the little rain that we've had doesn't even really wet the ground. Nevertheless, fruit are multiplying on the trees, and I've never seen the plum trees so full. And after such a bumper crop from the apple tree last year, even though it's little more than an established sapling, I wasn't really expecting much this year. But its branches are weighed low with apples. Sloe are also beginning to turn midnight blue, although still bullet hard. And there's a bee's nest in one of the nearby fields. A constant stream of bees clamber or fly out of their tunnel. And already they're making short work of plums. They're doing well, although I am half expecting to find that it's been dug up by a badger in the night. And complaints about the number of wasps have gone up. I keep quiet about the bees. It's hard to be a bee in a world where most people think bumblebees are the only type of bee. And it's also been a really good year for frogs. I've never seen here so many tiny froglets, clambering and scampering through the grass. However, this might be the result of the short grass getting scorched and making them a bit easier to spot than in previous years. But nevertheless, it's a lovely sight. First thing in the morning, the migration from land to water. And the ducks are regrouping, gathering in larger numbers again around the boats. And it's getting harder to distinguish the male from female. This year's juvenile drakes have as yet to shed their tawny uniforms, although one or two bottle green feathers are becoming visible. And a number of the adult males are also in molt and have shed their garish plumage of their natty head feathers. This is probably the main reason for them gathering into groups. When they lose their ability to fly, there is safety in numbers. Life here for the rest of July is going to be a little bit chaotic and a bit difficult to plan for at the moment. This year, the Erica's due for blacking again. Actually, one of the first episodes of this podcast I remember was on blacking when we did it around 4 years ago. Blacking is when the hull of the boat is pressure washed and cleaned off and repainted to protect it from corrosion. As most of the hull obviously is continuously underwater, we need to take her somewhere that can either crane her out of the water and onto dry land, or where there is a dry dock. Dry docks, if you think about them as a good boat-length long trench cut in the side of the canal that you can float a boat into, and then once in, boards can be lowered at the entrance and the water then drained out. It's an old and much practiced technique. The last time we did it, the Erica was craned out, but this year we're going to be taking her to a dry dock. It's not that far away, although far enough away by boat time to mean that it's going to disrupt a good couple of weeks for us, which to me at least is occurring at a really, really busy time at work. However, we are also hoping to combine it with something of a holiday in the middle of it all, where we've booked a shepherd's hut in which to stay. We're still not too sure how everything is going to line up. It's one of those things that on paper it's relatively simple to organise, but there are so many moving parts and variables that it's become almost impossible to predict with certainty how it's going to go. We're just going to have to be very, very flexible and drift along with the flow of things, as is normally the case with all things canal related. So the long and the short of all of this is that I'm fairly certain that I'm not going to be able to put out any more podcasts this month. So there might be a shortish hiatus, and I will resume at the beginning of August. We'll see. However, before all of that, thank you for contacting me. It's always so lovely to hear from you. And it was great to hear from our old friend Tony. And Tony, I hope that you're making headway with your work on the old lightship. It sounds a fascinating project. And hello also to Kelly Conway. It's lovely to hear from you again. And to MJ and Jason and LJ with Bodie and Karen Smith and Sherry Rauch. Thank you all for your comments and good wishes relating to my post last week. That was about the 3rd anniversary of Maggie moving on board and to share her life with us. And I agree, Sherry, as with so many others, I can't believe the time has flown by so fast either. But yes, she's been with us 2 whole years now. And there's just a quick update from Lee. She contacted me to say that 2 bears had been caught on her CCTV camera coming through her yard. And she shared them with me, and they look magnificent and really big. Thank you, Lee. And hello also to Rebecca Cook and Laurie Henderson and to Kaz over on YouTube. And Kaz, yes, the air coolers have held up well so far during most of those peak temperatures. I mean, the boat still gets pretty hot, particularly by the end of the day, but at least it remains bearable and a lot cooler than outside. And using ice cubes in the reservoirs again really makes a difference. And all that remains for me to say is thank you for contacting me, and a big thank you to all of our Lochwheelers for supporting this podcast. They are Susan Baker, Mind Shambles, Clare Hollingsworth, Kevin B., Fleur and David Mcloughlin, Lois Raphael, Tania Yorgey, Andrea Hansen, Chris Hinds, David Dirom, Chris and Alan on the narrowboat The Land of Green Ginger, Captain Arlo, Rebecca Russell, Alison on the narrowboat Mucker, Derek and Pauline on Silver Fox, Anna V, Orange Cookie, Mary Keane, Tony Rutherford, Arabella Holtzapfel, Rory with MJ and Kayla, the narrowboat Precious Jet, Linda Reynolds Perkins, Richard Noble, Carol Ferguson, Tracy Thomas, Mark and Tricia Stowe, and Madeline Smith. Thank you. There's a summer wind playing among the alders, and the evening is growing late, although the sun is still a good hand's breadth above the skyline, ribbed with the blue hills of Shropshire and the mountains of far distant Powys. Old hills, old lands. The air is still baked with the heat of today, despite a gusty wind blowing in from the west. Times like these always put me in mind of the line, "There's a warm wind blowing the stars around, and I really love to see you tonight." Although right now there are no stars, and I'm not sure who I would really love to see tonight. But there is a warm wind. And if there were stars above and the piling clouds would part for us to see them, I'm sure it would be blowing them around. Listen. Listen to the sigh of wind and leaf. Behind us on our left is a mature ash, and to the right are a stand of tall alders. The thick foliage, forest green, offered a very welcome shade this afternoon. When it's hot, stay close to trees is my motto. Although even with that you need caution. The long dry spell has meant that some trees are having to shed limbs, resulting in a sudden thud to disturb a walker or a boater. At this time of year, it doesn't take much of a breeze to make the trees talk. Listen. Listen to the ancient music of the wind in the trees. If we listen to the myths and legends of old, we need to tread cautiously here too. This is old music, untamed, unclaimed, with its claws still undrawn. This music can be rough music, for humans at least. We ignore it at our peril. Listen to the oak and the willow whisper. The man you have made king has donkey's ears. You can fool yourselves as much as you want, but there's no fooling us. Oh yes, myth and legend still speak to power, even today. The other week, a poster on social media, who calls themselves the hermit of everything, posted these words, which at the time struck a real chord with me. We tilt back our head to swallow the sun, letting radiance seep beneath our skin and sending our fingertips glowing. And then at night, we reach up and paint the stars, following the lines that tell a story. We are the storytellers, the makers of myth, remembrance of gods. And I think what struck home so forcibly in these words was that I tried to make a sort of similar, or at least related point in the last episode, or it might have been one of those just before it. Whatever the case, it was a thought that's been continually echoing around inside my head for quite a while. That and the problem of how do we, as a culture, relate to myth and legend after having become so divorced and disconnected from them? How can we use and listen to them when we've cultivated a mindset that can only process writings in certain rigid ways, that insists on reading myth in the same way as a scientific textbook and seems to be incapable of accepting the profound wisdom in the semantically and literary nonsensical? When even our imaginations have become so stunted by what we view as logic and reason, so that even our modern genres of fantasy must come tempered with large fistfuls of realism, and magic needs to comply with the laws of Euclid, Darwin, and rationality. That's not to say that there is no logic or undergirding reasoning to the older, more ancient myths. They too comply with their own sets of laws. And there's a sophistication and a coherency to them that flows on a number of levels, but not linear, the way we expect stories to work today, but circular, helical, a weaving of Möbius strands. The problem is that they become so far removed from our consciousness that we've become all but culturally illiterate to read them. Myths and legend run along a deeper current, out of sight to us most of the time, but nevertheless still speaking powerfully to us if we let them. And on an evening like this, rolling clouds, summer wind among the alders, what old stories still hang upon the air and mark the song lines that signpost our presents and our futures. Evenings like this are made for the sharing of stories. As the rain comes down, let's gather round, and I'll tell you an old story about an ancient king called Llefelys and his brother Llefelys. Well, as stories go, it's not really that old. We first hear of it in the great collection of Middle Welsh stories and songs, the Mabinogion. Actually, it occurs in a number of places within early English and Welsh literature, like Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, written around 1136, and the Welsh Triads, written around a century later. But it's the version that we find in the Mabinogion that is thought to preserve the quality of its antecedents most powerfully. And at this point, I feel I just need to quickly point out that stories like these, and especially ones much older than this, morph and change, and maybe even distort with the telling. These stories belong to the pre-Christian, pre-writing past, and the forms that we have them, they've been flattened and straightened by the set square and slide rule of Christian teaching and understanding. In fact, Geoffrey of Monmouth's chief interest in Llefelys, now in its anglicised form of Lludd, L-U-D, was to record his importance as the first king to found the city of London, named after him. And the account of the story that we are about to hear is almost certainly a later scribal addition to it. Geoffrey had altogether other fish to fry than recounting old stories. And like other clerical chroniclers contemporary to him, like Gildas and Nennius, a key objective of his history was to establish and embed the story of the Britons into the biblical narrative of the ongoing history of Israel. Their task was Heilgeschichte, sacred history, drawing the threads of the history of salvation through the scrambled lineage of Britain's petty kings and chiefdoms. Geoffrey of Monmouth and Nennius also make great play of linking our kings with the heroes of, for them, the much more recent histories of Greek and Roman worlds. The first histories of Britain make uncomfortable and awkward reading to modern patriots. It's somewhat ironic that today the figures described in the great tales and fables of the past are being used to establish an identity of true Englishness, are the very same figures who earlier were so eagerly viewed as of foreign ancestry, and whose legitimacy to rule was based on precisely that fact. But for exactly the same reasons. It was a nation in search of an identity. History and nationalistic myth-making are often closely entwined. But all this is leading us too far away from the sounds of summer wind among the alders and the rattling call of magpie. There are new stories to be told and old ones to be heard. Now listen. Long, long ago, perhaps on a day like this, bleached by sun and scalded by wind, when the alders roared and the wilder creatures slunk low in the shadows, a storyteller cleared his throat and began to speak. Now listen. Long, long ago, on the eve of Britain, there lived here a king who was young and fierce and generous, and he ruled his people with wisdom and grace. And not long after this king took his throne, 3 great oppressions befell his kingdom. Here begins the tale of King Llefelys, and hear it well, for we too have faced conflict and tyrannies, and know those times when our hearts fail within us. We too face uncertainty, and fires so powerful that they appear unquenchable. For that is the nature of the world, and of kingdoms, and of kings. Llefelys had a brother Llefelys, who through marriage became the King of France. The brotherly bonds that held these 2 men together was not just fraternal. They loved each other, and each respected the other for their strengths and stood by them in the times of their weaknesses. It was told how each would seek the other's counsel in matters of wisdom and statesmanship. Llefelys, the chroniclers say, was a good warrior, and benevolent and bountiful in giving food and drink to all who sought it. And so, under such a wise and prudent king, the land should have flourished and prospered. However, in time 3 oppressions fell upon the island of Britain, each one more terrible than the last, and the like of which had not been known of before. The first was the arrival of a strange race of people, the Coraniaid, fairy folk, some storytellers say. And their hearing was so great that any word, no matter how softly whispered in the secret places, that had been caught on the wind, they could hear. And there was no conversation that took place on the land, from Land's End in the south to the Orkneys in the far north, that they didn't know about. Their ears were as sharp and as acute as the willow's feathered leaves, and even those of the Alder that sigh above us tonight. And because of this, no harm could be done to them. Every plan was foiled, every attack met with complete resistance. This was an ancient land, paralyzed, locked tight in the grip of total and universal surveillance. And the second oppression was even greater than the first. Every year, on the eve of May Day, above every hearth, in the centre of every family home in the land, there occurred such a terrifying and lethal scream. It was so horrific and so loud that it was said that men's courage turned to water, and every woman who was bearing a child would miscarry. And it was also said that that haunting sound rang so deadly in the ears of the young, both young men and young women, that it would send them spiralling into madness. Even animals and trees, the earth and the water were left barren. And instead of being a day of fertility and festivity, May Days dawned sterile and desolate. The crops wilted, the fruit blossoms turned brown and dropped, the rivers and ponds stank with the smell of rotting fish, and the cry of grief and despair could be heard up and down the land. And there was no one who knew what caused this scream, or even where it came from, only that year after year after year it happened. Sages and wizards, saints and warriors were consulted, but no one knew how to rid the nation of this terrifying persecution. This was genocide or ethnic cleansing on a national scale, the wiping out of a people and the destruction of the land to make it uninhabitable. Environmental warfare, ecocide. Tyrannized by the Coraniaid, who seemed to be able to read even their deepest secrets, whispered to only the dark, and haunted by the oppressive shadow of that scream that they knew would be coming. How do you even begin to fight, to appropriately respond to the immensity of all that had befallen this island kingdom? But Leith and Britain's torments did not end there. There was a further third oppression that befell the land, and one that was as equally as puzzling as it was devastating. And this third affliction went like this. Any attempt to store surplus from the meagre harvests that had survived the howling roar of the eve of May scream, and lock them in barns or storehouses, whether that was crops, meat, beer, disappeared the night that it was stored. and even when placed under lock and key and guarded by watchmen, when the doors were opened the very next day, all that would be found would be an empty room, smelling of must and stale light. And King Llefelys was a sad and worried man as he watched his frightened people suffer under the 3 torments that had befallen them. And the enormity of it all was paralyzing. How could you attack or even challenge something so powerful, so pervasive, so great? Llefelys and his court advisers were at a complete loss. Even planning a response, even talking about the catastrophes, was fruitless. However, Llefelys was a wise man, and recognized that as great as the first oppression was, its cause was known, unlike the latter two, and that meant that there was a better hope of ending this oppression than the other two. So at his wit's end, Llefelys and a handful of his closest advisers and warriors silently, without word and with muffled footsteps, slipped out of the court and threaded their wordless way through forest and over downs to the south coast, where they found a boat and set off for France to consult Llefelys' brother, King Llefelys. As they put out to sea and rowed with strong oars into the channel, in the moonlight, they espied another boat coming toward them. Had the Coranites, despite all their painstaking precautions, got wind of their plan, and were now set out to thwart them? As the 2 boats closed in, Llefelys' oarsman's arms trembled with fear, unable even to pull a clean stroke. However, Llefelys knew his brother, and his brother knew Llefelys, and Llefelys stood bold in the prow of his small curragh boat, and his face broke into a smile that had not been seen for years and years. "Well met, brother," he called across the gloaming waters. And the old storytellers tell us that Llefelys already knew about the troubles that had come upon the land, and his heart had gone out to his dear brother and to his people. For as the sages say, there are more allies in adversity than we realize, and no oppression can keep them apart. Know your enemy is good counsel, but in doing so, remember not to forget your friends. There are many who share your heart and have dreamed those same dreams that fire and comfort your darker nights. And the 2 brothers embraced on that gentle sea swell as the gulls cried in the salty winds above their heads. But how could they share counsel without those same salty winds carrying Llefelys' wisdom and advice back to the twitching ears of the Coraniite? But Llefelys was a master tactician, and had already devised the building of a very long brass horn that glinted in the first light of dawn. At one end he held close to his mouth. The other, stretching across the water, Llefelys placed close to his ear. That way, Llefelys' words could not be picked up by the salty coastal winds and conveyed to the Coraniite. However, alas, when each brother tried to talk to the other, all the other heard was a vicious stream of insult and violent threats and profanity. It was good that each brother loved the other, for it could have quickly ended in war. but wise of counsel, Llefelys was quick to note what had happened. In the making of the brass horn, a demon had crept inside and was turning words of wisdom and perception into hostility and acrimony and animosity. And we all know, even today, how easily allies can be split by words of hate, and how easily they multiply, and how many a good cause has been thwarted not by the tactics of the opposition, but by the infighting that erupts seemingly out of nowhere among the allies. These old stories know the modern world very well. Quickly, Llefelys picked up a pitcher of good wine that he had beside him, and he poured it down the length of the horn, thus washing away the demon and allowing the conversation to proceed unobstructed. In this way, Llefelys instructed Lludd how to rid his kingdom of the 3 great oppressions that had fallen upon his land, and all without a single word reaching the itching ears of the Coraniaid. For the first oppression, Lludd crushed up some magic insects and mixed them with water. The concoction thus made, Llefelys had told him, would be poison to the Coraniaid when sprinkled on them, but harmless to humans. Therefore, when Lludd returned to London, he called a great conference where all should attend, both those of his own race and those of the race of the Coraniaid. The purpose of this conference, he announced, was his intention of making peace between his peoples and this strange fairy race who had oppressed them so severely. In due time, all the peoples gathered for the great conference. Lludd opened the proceedings by sprinkling the magical concoction over all those assembled, and in this way, as Llefelys had promised, the Coraniaid were driven out of the land. Another version of this story was that rather than offering Lludd the magic insects, Llefelys had told Lludd about a herb that grew abundantly in the meadows and byways of Britain, which would be lethal to the Coraniaid. I like this version better, as it goes on to tell how Lludd, on returning to Britain, set all his people to go out into the fields and the waysides to pick this flower, and then combine it with water and bring it to the conference, without, of course, informing them the real reason. I like the way that the solution rests on how this powerless and paralyzed people came together. After all, more than one historian of ancient history has taught us that the great social paradigm shifts that have occurred in human history rarely derive from the actions and ideas of the political and ruling elites. In most cases, they are driven by the people. And the second oppression was dealt in this way. The screams that had caused such devastation to the land were in fact those of the red dragon, who lived in a cave far underground. And she was being attacked by another dragon, a white one, who had come from overseas. And the screams were the sounds of pain from the red dragon's battle injuries as she fought for the land. Llefelys instructed Lludd to find the exact spot that was in the very centre of the island of Britain, and there dig a large pit and place in it a vast cauldron filled with mead and pasted with honey, and then to conceal it with a cloth of the finest brocade. Lludd found the spot, which is where Oxford now stands, and followed Llefelys' instructions. On the eve of May Day, Lludd climbed a hill and saw the writhing figures of 2 gigantic dragons, one red, one white. They fought and battled, biting and snarling, their bodies writhing like snakes, their vicious claws and armoured scales flashing in the late April sunlight. And after a while, exhausted, the two dragons plunged to earth, straight toward the spot where Llefelys had concealed the cauldron. Not seeing the trap, covered in rich brocaded cloth, they fell straight into the cauldron, and there they both gorged on the mead and the honey until not a drop of either was left. The storytellers then say how the dragons, filled with mead and honey, curled up together and fell asleep like two little kittens. Then, as Llefelys watched, spellbound at this transformation, a further transformation happened as they both turned into pigs. Llefelys leapt down into the cauldron, taking hold of the ends of the brocaded cloth that the dragons had landed upon in their exhaustion, wrapped up the two now sleeping pigs, and placed them in a waiting wagon. Crossing the great silver ribbon of the River Severn into Wales, across mountains wreathed in heather and cloud, and that sang of waterfalls and eagle calls, Llefelys placed them in two stone chests, secure in the heart of Snowdonia. Here the story bisects and follows new routes, as is the nature of stories like these. And one of them picks up on the tale of the red dragon buried here in the heart of Wales, and it is from these stories that even today the red dragon is used as the proud symbol of Wales and the Welsh people. And that leaves the third and final oppression, the mystery of the empty barns and storehouses. Once again, Llefelys followed precisely the instructions of his far-seeing brother Llefelys. And one night, after seeing his main storehouse filled to the brim with surplus grain and flagons of best wine, Llefelys ordered his perplexed watchmen to stand down for the night. "Tonight," he told them, "will be my turn to be watchman." And so Llefelys settled down on a small wooden stool beside the one padlocked door. And beside him he had set a large barrel filled with water, fresh from the Thames and still smelling of waterweed, fin, eel and pike. Night fell and darkness deepened, just like it is tonight. And the stars fled before the racing clouds, and the thin fingernail crescent of the moon shone cold and lonely that night. First, silence fell, but for the scurry of rats and the mournful whoop of a distant owl. And then, as he sat, strange, eerie music began to whisper and unfurl like phantom night mists. It sounded unearthly, haunting, unsettling, and yet at the same time Llefelys began to feel his eyelids get heavier and heavier. He stood up and plunged his head into the barrel of water. And for a while the music abated. But then, softly, it returned. And this time as beautiful and as beguiling as the first was unsettling. And again Llefelys's eyelids drooped. He fought the tiredness with the ferocity of a she-lion defending her cubs. And his eyes felt as if they were filled with dry dust and grit, and no matter how much he rubbed them, they demanded to be closed. and again Llefelys plunged his head and then his feet into the icy Thames water, and then he shook himself free of drowsiness like a dog. And a third time the music came, and this time soft and sweet, as soporific as a children's lullaby, and Llefelys' head dropped to his chest. His eyes felt as if honey had been poured over them and was gluing his eyelids shut. And this time Llefelys dragged his exhausted body to the barrel and plunged head first into it. And when he climbed out, he shook himself as a polar bear does when climbing onto an ice floe. And so the night wore on, until, look, in the faint penumbra of veiled starlight, the bulky shape of a giant, schooled in the arts of magic and wizardry, can be seen stealthily climbing the storehouse steps. Wearing full battle armour, the giant carries with him a large wickerwork hamper. Llefelys watched, cunning and ready, his eyes sharp and wicked as a wolf, as the giant placed his hand on the padlock, which sprang open to his whispered command, and then he opened the door. And once inside the storehouse, the giant proceeded to empty its entire contents into his wickerwork hamper. And strange it was to Llefelys, stranger than the enchanting music, stranger than the size of the man, stranger even than his ability to command locks to open. The strangest of all was that he could fit the entire contents of a large storehouse into one wickerwork hamper. At this, Llefelys leapt to his feet with sword in hand and cried, "Stop! How dare you insult me and despoil the land that is in my care? How dare you cause hunger and grief to fall upon my nation?" At this, the giant enchanter swung round, sword raised, and there was a mighty encounter. Sparks flew from iron on iron and iron on stone. Swordlight flashed in the pale moonlight. The battle waged long and hard. But in the end, Llefelys wrestled the enchanter to the ground, where he begged for mercy and sought Llefelys' protection. Llefelys agreed to spare the giant magician's life in exchange for his service and the reparation of all he had stolen. And the Mabinogion ends this tale with these words: "And that is how Llefelys freed the island of Britain of the free plagues. From then until the end of his life, Llefelys, son of Beli, ruled the island of Britain in peace and prosperity. And this is called the tale of Llefelys and Llefelys." And so it ends. And so it ends. Or does it? Until the next time, at least. G.K. Chesterton rightly said that fairy tales do not tell children that dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons can be killed. Perhaps that's what these old stories will tell us if we let them speak. Not that the world is hurting and the people in it are often broken and capable of such evil and cruelty. We know that already. What they tell us is that no matter how bleak things feel, there are paths that can be taken to restore the things that have been broken. And amidst all the hurting and wounding, there is a path to bring healing. Perhaps that is what the story of Llefelys and Llefelys tells us. Perhaps that's what all the old stories tell us. And perhaps Tonight, if we listen carefully, that is what the summer wind among the alders is whispering to us. The dragons we face can be overcome. And with that, this is the narrowboat Erica signing off for the night and wishing you a very restful and peaceful night. Good night. Temperature outside 17.6 degrees. Inside 23 degrees. Humidity 91%. Dew point 16 degrees. Wind direction southwest. Wind speed 9 miles per hour. Barometric pressure 1009.5 falling. Cloud cover 91%. Cloud ceiling 10,000 feet. Precipitation 0.76 millimeters. Moon phase 78% waxing gibbous. Day length 16 hours 37 minutes. Sunset 21:30. Sky casting 4:54.